Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our fourth Wisconsin Robotics seminar today. We are very pleased to have Dr. Bradley Hayes, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. He leads the Collaborative AI and Robotics Lab, which does great research in human-robot interaction and explainable AI. He also serves as CTO at Circadence, a cybersecurity and education tech company. And I've known Brad for a few years now, and I'm very excited to host him today for our seminar. So we are welcoming questions from the audience. So please post them in the chat in YouTube, and we'll be asking them to our speaker at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Bradley Hayes.
Thank you for the great introduction. I'm really happy to be here, able to talk about some of the great work that my PhD students have been doing with me. And so I'll apologize in advance if you were here because of the title thinking I was going to introduce the successor to the transformer architecture. I just figured I had to jump on the ML hype title bandwagon. But all the same, I do think that this is a true statement that if we really do want to get safer collaborative robots and, more importantly, responsible deployment of artificially intelligent systems, that we need to focus on multimodal communication. And so, as Emmanuel said, I direct the Cairo Lab, Collaborative AI and Robotics Lab at CU Boulder. And this work was funded in some combination of internal seed grants, Army Research Lab, and NSF grants. And you can find my contact info on the right side of this slide. And if you have any questions or follow-ups on any of this material, please feel free to reach out to me. So as I mentioned, all of the work that I'm going to be talking about today came from my fantastic PhD students. And in particular, I will be focusing on work by Carl Mueller, Matt Lubers, Shivendra Agrawal, and Akib Tabrez. So I'd like to start by talking about collaborative robotics. So we've had this idea of collaborative robotics for a really long time. In fact, collaborative robotics V1, I would somewhat describe as get the robots on the floor, we'll figure it out later, right? People will adapt to the robots. People are extremely adaptive, and what could go wrong? But now we can tell that we're moving into maybe a more mature era of collaborative robotics where we've seen some of the horror stories and we're recognizing that human-robot interaction research has something to contribute in order to make these interactions safer, make people better at their jobs with these robots, and in general, avoid some of these kinds of accidents. And so if you were to go onto Google image search right now and search for human-robot collaboration or collaborative robots, we start to see robot coworkers, right? So we don't see a lot of cages here. And we're able to do that because, ostensibly, we have algorithms, sensors, and insights from HRI research that can get us to this kind of happy coexistence. But even in these photos, I would argue that people aren't really collaborating with the robots, especially this one on the right. That person is coexisting with the robot. They're not necessarily working together. They're kind of back to back, and that is impressive. But if we kind of dive deeper into that, say, Google image search, I would argue that we're at Collaborative Robotics V2 right now, which is the happy people smiling with robots phase, right? Everybody looks really happy to be working with their robot, except for this person. But in their defense, the robot doesn't look terribly happy either. And I would say that we're at the point now where we can somewhat safely put robots and people in the same spaces, but I think we're far away from actually achieving some kind of productive collaboration between the two of them. And so I'll be talking today about some of the ways that we can try to get there by using examples of my own group's work to lead the way. And so I'd like to start by asking, like, if we've solved this problem, where are the collaborative robots and what kind of form is that collaboration going to take? Well, there are a bunch of different possible answers for that. So here we have three different examples of collaboration. So in the top, we have supportive collaboration. So we have a leader and a support. So Tony Stark is building the Iron Man suit while the Jarvis robot is holding a magnifying glass up to make it easier for him. And this is supportive because it's not actually advancing the state of the task. It's just making it easier, right, to accomplish it. So it's reducing the lead's cost. In the bottom left, we have a leader assistant. So that assistant is necessary, right, and is contributing something to the dynamics of the task such that it can be accomplished, but they're not really driving it. And then, of course, in the bottom right, we have an equal partners framework where everybody has their own responsibilities and we have a more flat architecture. And obviously, we'd like to see robots take all of these different forms of collaboration and thrive with it. But what we have right now at the current state of the art is something that's very easy to mistake for collaboration, which is choreography. So if we were to look at this video from Boston Dynamics, where there's the Spot robot with its arm giving Diet Coke, this looks like coordination, but then we can quickly kind of see that this is more choreography, and the robot does something that the person doesn't expect, which leads to a breakdown in the team fluency. And so just like you wouldn't want to have to experience this situation, we want to try to figure out ways that we could better condition people and robots to understand what's going to happen. And maybe if we enter into a failure mode or a state bordering on a failure mode, we can figure out how to get out of it. So I would like to break down human-robot collaborative behavior into this iceberg diagram. So if at the top we have collaborating during task execution, then under the water surface, right, the things that make this problem tractable are that we would have understandable teammates, which means that we have shared expectations with respect to decision making. And then at a lower level than that, we have safe teammates, which indicates a shared expectation on actual behavior. And so we know, and we've shown through lots of collaborative robotics research and human-robot teaming research, that teaming tends to excel under shared situational awareness. And we can learn a lot from human teams, which we know excel with the right training and the right experience. And we can also learn a lot from multi-agent systems research, where we know that agent teams tend to excel with just enough training. But once we try to put these two groups together, my key premise of this talk is that human agent teams can only excel through multimodal communication, primarily because we have different mechanisms for really encoding the world and acting on the world and developing our policies. And the way that my group tries to address these problems is through explainable AI techniques. But a very important caveat on that is that while explainable AI can foster appropriate trust and help avoid automation abuse, just like your car's seatbelt, it's kind of irrelevant if you're not using it right. And so we strive to achieve these different attributes to interpretability, meaning that we can enable an understanding of the mechanics of a system, right? So how does the system use its features in its decision making, as well as comprehensibility, which says we understand what the features are that it's actually looking at that feed into those mechanics. But importantly, right, these help us get to an explainable system, but they don't actually necessarily yield useful explanations by themselves. And so this is what we're going to use to kind of fill in some of the cracks with our problem formulation as follows. So going back to our iceberg, right, if we have human-robot collaboration on the top here, we can just basically formulate this as an optimization problem subject to some cost function that gives us a great value when we achieve the goal together with no one getting hurt. And this whole bottom part of the iceberg are the unintended consequences that stem from a malformed or underspecified optimization problem. And even though the top here says human-robot collaboration, this could just as easily describe 99% of robotics. And so we want to try to help mitigate unintended consequences through communication. So in order to start, we're going to first look at establishing shared expectations for behavior, and we're going to look at this through learning from demonstration, right? So humans are great at learning from examples, and so it stands to reason that we'd want our robots to do so as well. But really, this is an attractive paradigm because we're not very good at crafting cost or reward functions. But we are very good at actually doing things. So this seems like a great idea. But it also turns out that humans aren't great at demonstrations sometimes either. So if we look at this robotic garbage truck, somebody is teleoperating this arm that's supposed to help move the garbage can into the receptacle there. And as we can see, the operator's having quite a bit of trouble with it. And eventually they just give up on it entirely. And so if we're going to live in a world where we have non-robotics experts, but maybe task experts who are providing demonstrations, we have to live with this notion that they might not be able to capture all of the relevant details through these demonstrations alone. And so the first paper I'm going to talk about for my group is called Robust Robot Learning from Demonstration and Skill Repair using conceptual constraints. So this came out in IROS 2018. And to motivate this problem, we'll start by talking a little bit about robot motion planning. So our problem statement is we're trying to find a trajectory that goes from some start state to some goal state. And this is a really high-dimensional problem, so we're going to have to use probabilistic search methods to actually come up with a solution for it. But to make things more difficult, our desired trajectory is going to be subject to a bunch of optimization criteria through some cost function here called U. And this is going to have to mitigate things like collisions or violations of social norms. And so the insight is this is worth solving, obviously, because trajectories accomplish tasks for us. The challenge is that there are a whole bunch of latent constraints that are imposed on these trajectories that keep them useful, right? That have them not violate human preferences or task or social norms. And so the reality is that objective functions like this one that I took out of the Chomp paper are not accessible or interpretable to experts, let alone like lay end users. Right? So if I told you that this is the function that your robot is optimizing in its motion planner, you may have a hard time really understanding what it's going to do for a given start and end state, partially because it's such a high-dimensional problem and there are probably a lot of viable solutions for it. So this sets the stage for what we're trying to actually accomplish here, right? We're solving high-dimensional problems. Now, a traditional imitation learning pipeline looks like this. So the first thing we do is we gather a data set. So we record a whole bunch of trajectories. Then the next step, and as a personal side note, I feel like this is the one that has the most hand-waving right now in robotics and would be a great place for further research, is alignment of these demonstration trajectories. So here we can see in this figure that I pulled off of Wikipedia that for two differently timed walking behaviors, right, we're going to get comparable trajectories, but it's really important for us to temporally align these things properly when we're actually building a model from it. So we took our demonstration data, we align it, and then we want to cluster and train different models of sub-goals. So we're breaking this bigger problem up. So we're no longer going from just some start state to some end state, but rather we're going from some start state through some intermediate waypoints, right, that define really the task that we're doing to that goal state. So what's wrong with learning from demonstration? Well, trajectory-based demonstrations do have low overhead, right? So we can collect them from users directly, but that also means that they have limited information content. So in order to cover the full range of solutions, we're going to need a whole lot of demonstrations. And a big problem with this comes up when we start talking about implied constraints, such as filled cups should be carried upright, because these are generally drawn from common sense. And it's easy to leave this kind of thing out of your optimization formulation. And so if we require common sense, that's a problem because our robot doesn't have it. And our users probably can't safely encode these constraints into those objective functions without more side effects occurring. And so one option is to just say, well, let's just learn everything. Let's throw more data at it. But that would probably require a prohibitively large number of trajectories. Like, yes, we've scaffolded our common sense from something, so maybe our robots can too. But you probably don't have time to collect or train that data from that data set, which probably means you're going to have to borrow somebody else's, right? And you probably still shouldn't trust that because you're not really going to know what's in there. And so in order to get around this problem, and the core insight from this paper was that we can look at trajectory demonstrations as one valuable modality and semantic specification as a second. And so here, what we can see is that trajectory demonstrations are great at providing precise specifications of behavior, but they have fairly narrow coverage. Whereas semantic specification, such as narrating a task, has quite the opposite strengths and weaknesses. So it's very coarse. It's extremely difficult to provide, directly applicable motor commands via semantic specification, but it is very easy to apply high-level concepts. And so if I have a trajectory demonstration set like this, where I've seen the paths from the start state to the goal state that go over the obstacle, I don't really know if it's okay to take the bottom path. To ground this in an example that popped up over the last few years, we can look at this security robot, and maybe it doesn't know if it can go left or right around that plant that we can see at the far left of the image. And so the robot tries to go left around the plant because, well, the model doesn't really know, and it turns out that that's not acceptable. That was a bad idea. And then on the semantic specification side, if anybody has not seen this exact specification challenge where you ask children to describe how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I highly recommend it. Hopefully my sound will be working here, but I'll play this clip. And if it's not, maybe somebody can just shoot me a message in the chat and then I'll narrate over it.
I could really go for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Do you guys think you can write
like it may not be working?
Teach me how to make a peanut butter and jelly
Here
sandwich?
he's saying like, I could really go for peanut butter and somebody explains
Step one, get
so
2 pieces of bread.
Got
Get a butter knife and get some kiwi.
Get some peanut
Take
butter.
1 piece of
Now,
bread,
take the butter
spread it around with the butter.
No, Dad, whisk your peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
Obviously, that's not what they intended, but that is what they instructed. And so this is a problem that even we as fully grown roboticists frequently encounter. So we want to combine the strengths of both of these modalities in order to get us something that provides a better source of skill knowledge. And the way that we encode this semantic specification is as constraints over the task that we're learning from demonstration. So as people are demonstrating their trajectory, we ask them to narrate the constraints that they would like to apply over it. So for example, if the robot is carrying a cup from point A to point B, they might narrate at some point, keep the cup upright before, say, they pour it out into the target receptacle. And so we can take these Boolean state classifiers and encode these as the constraints over top of our actions. And that way, like, we can just take a state and say, is this state in violation of our constraint or not? And if it is in violation of the constraint, then we can reject that part of the trajectory and replan over it. And so because we're just using these Boolean classifiers, we can pretty much pick an arbitrary set of constraints to do this. So, such as grasping and holding constraints, positional, or even motion-based ones, depending on what our state space looks like. So for an upright constraint on a cup, we can show that, okay, so this is perfectly upright. This is also okay. Our Boolean classifier would say false for this. And now we can use this to apply it over some of these keyframes that we're learning so that when we're sampling and we're planning between keyframes, we know that we can like either accept or reject those trajectories. Now, what ends up happening once we start applying these constraints is we end up with a much more complicated motion planning problem than we started. So the algorithm that we present in this paper, concept-constrained learning from demonstration, essentially constructs a sequential constrained motion planning problem where different manifolds or like acceptable regions of our configuration space are going to apply over different parts of our task. And so this can, again, present a pretty hard motion planning problem because now it's not just a high-dimensional problem, it's a high-dimensional problem that is now existing maybe on some complicated manifolds, manifolds that may not have intuitive connections between them. And so we address this problem in the paper by reshaping those learned keyframes, the ones that we get from the demonstration data, with the constraints around them. And so in the bottom of the slide here, we can see 3 different mechanisms for doing this. We do the one on the left, which is rejection sampling. So we sample from each keyframe a whole bunch of times, and then we keep the ones that are in compliance with the specified constraints, and then we reshape the keyframe around those. But we can also use projection methods if, of course, there is a gradient to follow, or even these like remapping approaches. But for this paper, we just use rejection sampling. Okay, so let's look at what happens when we actually do this. So we can train a skill, and in this case, we trained a cup pouring task. And we trained it with 3 somewhat adversarial demonstrations. So in the first one, the first demonstration, we would have the robot pick up the cup and tilt its wrist to the left, more or less to the threshold of what was acceptable for upright. Move it across the table, and then pour it out into a cup. The second demonstration, we tilted the wrist all the way to the right side of acceptability, right? So it's not quite pouring the cup out, but it's pretty close. And then demonstrated across table and pour it out. And then for the third demonstration, we had the cup perfectly upright. Now, if we fit, say, like a Gaussian model to each of these keyframes, we're going to get high variance. And in particular, there's still going to be probability mass in their areas where the robot is going to sample, say, a wrist configuration that pours this cup out. And what we see happening when we try to just replay this skill using just the demonstration trajectories is that the robot more or less interpolates along the way using our motion planner so that it starts pouring the cup out very early on in the skill, right? And by the time it reaches this destination, this yellow roll of tape, everything is gone. But if we have somebody narrate, say, keep the cup upright, as an example, then even with these adversarial demonstrations, we can see that it is able to reshape those keyframes such that it can take the correct action here. And so we've also done this with various positional constraints. So even if you learn a skill in configuration space, which is pretty much the default for a lot of these learning from demonstration papers that we've seen, we can still, through this rejection sampling, update these skills as the environment changes using the rejection sampling process as a way to kind of refine them. So one of the task results from the paper, we can see that just one narrated example can fix this skill. But even just trying to provide more and more demonstrations gets you somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem for you. So the insight here was that having people communicate to the robot in ways other than just the trajectory demonstration is really helpful. But we also know, right, that shared expectations are critical, and these shared expectations aren't just one way. So we can say that fluent teaming requires communication, right? When there's any kind of incomplete prior knowledge, when something unexpected happens during task execution, or really when there's some kind of joint action. And part of that is just because humans are somewhat imprecise, right, in how we can apply forces and whatnot. And so in human-robot collaboration, we could look at this as imposing requirements. So one, that humans need to be able to plan around robot behavior in expectation, right? Which means we need models of their behavior. And understanding the failure modes and their world model, right? So like how do they, how is the software going to interpret the state of the world? And what is their belief over that state of the world? These are essential things for us. And all of this kind of leads to the central point of the robots are going to need to communicate back to us as well. So to close out on the learning from demonstration part of this talk, I just want to put a brief teaser out there for our ICRA 21 paper, Augmented Reality for Constrained Learning from Demonstration, where we take that system that I just talked about, and now we give the robot the ability to visualize parts of the skills and the constraints over top of them so that people can refine skills and get a better idea of what the system is doing. So I'll play a short 1.5-minute clip here. So this is viewed through the Microsoft HoloLens. These end effector positions are sampled from keyframes. They go from fully saturated to fully gray to indicate progress through time for the skill. And this interface also allows people to edit and refine the things that they did while they were demonstrating. So sometimes you're completely occupied while you're trying to demonstrate a skill with the robot, and you don't really have the mental bandwidth to concentrate on the different constraints. And so this gives you a way to kind of visually look and see what's happening so that you can then refine tasks to make sure that the robot is going to be sampling configurations from those keyframes that are acceptable to you. So here, we first have the user give kinesthetic demonstrations. We let the person visualize it. So you might notice that there's a new obstacle on the table that wasn't there during demonstration. So somebody put that obstacle in place. And so now we can edit the skill, right, without providing new demonstrations by, say, imposing a constraint that some of these keyframes have to be above that purple plane. The robot can then reshape its keyframes. It'll resample demonstration trajectories. And then the person can see what the robot's about to do, say, before it's going to start executing that skill. So you can at least get an intuition, right, for what that skill is going to look like and the areas that it's going to sample its configurations from. All right. So for the first half of the talk, we focused on shaping the robots to match the humans' expectations. But as I mentioned, the robots need to communicate to us with us as well. And so now I want to talk about shaping humans to match the robots' expectations. And this is unfortunately even more complicated than it sounds because humans aren't strictly rational. So if we had a rational model of behavior, we could just perform this argmax on the left, right? So you just assume the human's going to, of course, pick the action that maximizes their expected reward. So research has shown that that's not really what happens, and we can smooth this out, right, as a noisy rational model. And there are lots of reasons why people wouldn't act rationally from one frame of reference. And so we can introduce this parameter theta into the softmax here that essentially says that better actions are exponentially more likely, but we can tune theta between 0, which would mean completely random action selection, and infinity, which would mean completely rational. Right? And so now we have this bit of noise that we can play with to have our robots get maybe more accurate models of human behavior insofar as uncertainty is concerned. And more recent work has even taken insights from cumulative prospect theory and loss aversion to kind of bias this noisy model more like human behavior. And so this next paper that I'm going to talk about is called Improving Human-Robot Collaboration Through Autonomous Explanation-Based Reward Coaching. So this is a paper where we're taking a competent robot and we're going to have it teach a human how to do something during task execution. So this work is motivated by the idea that we're pretty good at this point of taking a novice robot and turning it into something that can actually accomplish a task. But we are less good at this transition, right, from competent partner to capable instructor. And so we want to know, how can we use the robot's expertise to make others more proficient? In other words, we spent all this time and effort training, let's say, some reinforcement learning model. How do we extract insights out of that to make others better at what they're doing when maybe they're not at that level yet? And so this is a different problem from plan explanation and improving plan explicability, because we're addressing the underlying model that helps produce those plans, right? So we're trying to get at the source, not some of the outputs. And we know that learning from experience can be expensive. Robots will typically explore until they break themselves. Some people are also similar. And so the motivating questions here were, how can an agent use its understanding of the world to figure out your understanding? And then once we have that, how can an agent identify the important points of divergence between its world model and its teammates? And then what information must we communicate to achieve model reconciliation? And for this work, we make a couple of assumptions. Namely, one, humans are goal-directed, generally rational agents that maximize their expected reward. And if we see confusing behavior, that means that there's some difference in domain understanding. So if we put this more into more rigorous language, then we might say that humans have a policy learning algorithm that works, and that an unexpected policy is going to indicate a difference in reward function, because we're going to assume that they understand the transition dynamics of the world that they're interacting with. And so the algorithm that we introduced in this paper was called reward augmentation and repair through explanation. And we can illustrate this problem through this simple grid world example. So if we have two terminal rewards, R1 and R2, then we would expect a rational agent to take this path on the left, right? They would go up and then take the 100 reward on the right, because that's greater than 10. But if we saw a human that took this path, where they get to the middle cell and then they turn left and they go for the 10 reward, the only explanation here would be that they don't know about that R2. They don't know about the 100 reward, which is why they're seeking the 10. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we tell them that that 100 reward is there to get them to actually pursue that instead? So the way that we accomplish this is by trying to estimate the collaborator's reward function by figuring out which policy they're following and working backwards from there to recover their reward function that produced that policy. And we assume that the policies are optimal with respect to the reward function that produced them. Again, going back to that, their policy learning algorithm works. And so this requires us to track a belief over reward functions. And the way that we do this is we use latent Boolean state variables to indicate whether they know about a particular reward or not. So in this case, we would have two latent variables corresponding to the human understanding that R1 was there and corresponding to R2 being there. And in this case, it's important to note that we are not handling the misshapen reward function where you have spurious rewards. That's sort of out of scope for this particular work. So we take the state vector and we divide it into world variables and reward comprehension variables. So your world variables were what you started with, maybe your x and your y position, and then your comprehension variables are the ones that indicate what reward function you're following. So to go back to this original example, we would have in state 1 here, maybe we're assuming that you don't know about any of them, or that this is the dominant probability mass for a belief vector over reward functions. But by the time we get to S3, by the time we get to that left cell, it's most likely that the person knows about R1 and doesn't know about R2. So that's kind of the intuition for how we're modeling all of this. And so if we look into this example, right, as the person or the agent is moving forward, we don't necessarily know much about their understanding of the problem. But as soon as they do this, we recognize that we have to communicate this reward before they finish and achieve a terminal reward state. And so we looked at 2 different options for that. So option 1 was to encourage exploration. And the way that we did that was say, well, if you go to R1, you're not going to get the best reward. So if you go north right now, you will not get the best reward. And that might assume that the person will then explore for R2, knowing that it's out there somewhere. The second option was more directed, saying, if you go north right now, you won't get the best reward, but there's a better reward in the top right corner. And so we justify the advice that we're giving by providing a description of the actual location of the reward. And if the action is meaningful for how you achieve those rewards, then you can easily put that state action pair into this framework, and we still get the same kind of results out of this. And so in order to do this one, we need some way to describe states, right? We need to incorporate language, and collaborative robotics is hard enough. We're not going to solve language. So the way that we accommodate language in our work is, again, by using a set of Boolean classifiers. So in this case, we're treating them as planning predicates. And so these are just the general functions that take a state in and then output true or false, right? So A could be on top of B, right? True or false. The paint is drying, true or false. Camera is powered, true or false. And it helps me to visualize this, to think of it graphically. So if we had a 2D state space where white pixels indicated states where it is false and blue pixels indicate states where it's true, then maybe we could represent on top with this shape, and we could represent something like camera powered with this shape. So now that we have these different shapes that describe different concepts, we can apply a Boolean algebra to this library of predicates in order to be more expressive about what we can describe. And so what this means is we can take intersections, unions, and negations of this library of predicates to try to define or specify specific state areas. This reduces state description to a set cover problem over predicate selection. And so with the right disjunctive norm formula of these, and of course the right predicate dictionary, we should be able to specify arbitrary collections of states that we can then use in these algorithms. So whenever I'm talking about us generating natural language, this is the framework that we're using for that. And of course, in order to actually convert these predicates into something that people understand, we also assume that there's mapping from each predicate to some natural language utterance. And so the DNF is just going to concatenate all of that together for us. So we evaluated our algorithm for this in a collaborative game with a robot. And so this game is real-time color Sudoku. So it's a 6x6 puzzle. The board that matters is the one in the middle here. The one on the top is the human's bin of pieces, and the one on the bottom is the robot's bin of pieces. So the only thing that really matters here is the center board. And the way that people play this game is they fill in their rows. So they have the nearest 3 rows to them, and the robot has the nearest 3 rows to it. And you fill it in near to far, right to left with different colored blocks. There's no notion of a turn, so you just kind of go when you're ready, which makes this quite difficult because there are going to be effects that earlier play has on later play. And so just like Sudoku, or at least our analog, we have some constraints that the players have to follow. So one is this row constraint, which says that no color can appear twice on the same row. And this is fairly easy to solve coming at the beginning of the game. And the second one is an adjacency constraint that says no color can border itself. And this is the one that really gets complicated as the game progresses, because not just your early choices, but also the robot's early choices are going to inform how the game proceeds and if there's a viable solution for it. Now, participants were fully briefed beforehand that the robot is not only an expert at this game, but this game is collaborative. The robot is on your team and wants to win. And so in order to win the game, you both have to complete the board without violating any of the constraints. Everybody was briefed on this, and everybody indicated that they understood. So we ran a between subjects experiment looking at 2 different cases of robot assistance and robot coaching. So our control condition was that we had players who were about to make a mistake. So if they were about to pick a color that was going to lead to an irrecoverable failure of the games by violating a constraint, the robot would interrupt them and tell them that they cannot make that move or they'll lose the game. And this is analogous to that option 1 from before, where we say, hey, if you do that, you're not going to get the best reward. The justification condition had the robot tell them about where the missing reward was. So in this case, it gave them information about the constraint that they were going to violate and the state of the board that got them to that constraint violation. So we told them about the negative reward. And then the last condition here is our no interruption condition. And this was somewhat of a default condition. If you made it through the entire game without making any mistakes or about to make any mistakes, then there was no interruption because there's no reason for the robot to talk to you in that case. And so you can see in this figure on the left, a brief description of how the interaction works. And so we had a bunch of subjective hypotheses and one important objective hypothesis that we wanted to test with this experiment. So the subjective hypotheses were mostly the standard fare that you would see in HRI studies, which is namely that people will find the robot more helpful and more useful when it explains why a failure might occur, and that participants are going to find the robot to be more intelligent when it provides a justification for its advice, assuming that showing that deeper understanding is something that people will correlate with intelligence. And then, of course, that people will find the robot more sociable when it provides these justifications. And we collected survey results, post-experiment surveys, and we were able to validate our first 2 hypotheses. We didn't have enough statistical power to confidently validate the 3rd hypothesis. But the real thing that we were interested in with this work was our objective hypothesis, that participants will complete the game faster when provided with that justification, right? So this intuitively means that they're going to be given information, like more targeted information about where this negative reward was, so that should help them avoid it better. But we couldn't test this hypothesis. And we couldn't test this hypothesis because most of the participants didn't even listen to the controlled conditions advice that didn't provide that justification. So the robot would tell them, hey, if you do this, we will lose the game. And 80% of the control condition participants ignored that, made the move anyway, and shockingly lost the game. Compare that to the justification condition, where only 20% of participants did that. And when we asked them why afterwards, one of them said they didn't hear the robot, and one of them said that they weren't paying attention to anything other than the game. And so this was really surprising for us. And in our current work, we're really kind of trying to tease apart what constitutes a viable or a valid justification. Does that justification need to be true? Does it need to be anything but ridiculous? We're not really sure yet. But in this work, we developed this algorithm, RARE, Reward Augmentation and Repair Through Explanation. We evaluated it through a cooperative cognitive game. And we found that that justification for advice was extremely important. And through that, we showed that we were able to use this to make robots into better coaches. But also we learned that justification was essential, at least in these kinds of domains, for effective knowledge transfer, subject to the limitations, right, that people, or the priors that people brought in to this problem. But this work is really only focusing on just-in-time coaching, right? So we said, all right, you're about to take an action that we don't think you should take, so we're going to coach you away from that. But what we'd really like to get to is policy elicitation, right? So we don't want to just tell you, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. We want to figure out what can we tell you that gets you to change your underlying policy, right? To behave better more generally. And this introduces a whole bunch of problems because that expressivity comes at a great cost. So to provide these broader behavioral updates, right, we're solving a state description problem. But now we're solving, arbitrary regions of states, right? So we need to describe lots of different state regions. This is a figure from the DenseCap paper by Andre Karpathy, Justin Johnson, and Feifei Li. If we took all of these detections and said each one's a predicate, and then we intersected all of them together, we still wouldn't precisely define this state. And so that's something that we took into the design consideration for this last work I'm going to talk about in the next 5 to 10 minutes, which is called one-shot policy elicitation via semantic reward manipulation. And so here we're trying to provide some kind of semantic update to a person in order to change their model of the world to elicit the policy that is more in line with what we want. And the algorithm that we introduced for this is called SPEAR, or Single Shot Policy Explanation for Augmenting Rewards. And the key notion inside of SPEAR is that we have an acceptable level of abstraction and as such an allowable amount of over or understatement. And I'll make this concrete with a concrete example here. So this is the CU Boulder Engineering Center. And if you were to come to our engineering center for an event hosted in the south part of the building where the yellow box is, and then a fire broke out somewhere, if we had, say, some kind of intelligent building alerting system that went off and then told everybody in this event center, including the people who have only ever been to this building for this event and probably don't know their way around, that these 3 rooms, ECCR 105, 116, and ECCS 111 were on fire, that's probably not going to be very helpful for you, right? That won't help you pick a better route out of the building than if it had just said, oh, like there's a fire somewhere. And so we can come up one level of abstraction here and say, oh, well, what if we said the computer science wing and the classroom wings are on fire? Now, that's not strictly true, right? It's an overstatement. But maybe that's more interpretable to people, and they can use that in order to update their policy. But you're here for the first time. And so we might be able to reason that even that means nothing to you. And so we can go up another level of abstraction, say the southwest part of the building is on fire, right? Again, this is stretching the truth, but if the goal is to elicit a particular type of policy from you, this may be what it takes given the language and understanding combined between the agents. So we use this emergency evacuation domain as our proof of concept. And just like before, we're using these planning predicates as the basis for our language. So here we can see we have various hallways. And we can isolate states like this top right hallway state by saying something like in the north hallway and in the east hallway, right? Because that uniquely identifies one particular state. And so when a fire breaks out, we have this problem. The agent's model of the world and our model of the world as the knowledgeable expert diverge from each other. And so here, the default policy of the human agent might be to go to the nearest exit. And so they'll follow this red dotted line that goes to the exit in the middle of the figure. But what we'd like them to do is take this blue path. And so what we need to be able to do is figure out what natural language utterance to give them, right, in order to elicit that blue policy. So in this case, by saying, hey, there's a bad reward in the center hallway, it's a bit of overstatement, right, at least by 3 cells, but that achieves the desired policy. And so the components of our algorithm include 2 things we've talked about before, belief estimation and identifying important model divergences, but one new thing, which is solving for reward updates to communicate based on this desired policy. And so for belief estimation, we use the same framework as before. So we're using a markup decision process framework. And again, any improper behavior is due to a malformed reward function rather than anything else. So if we have this true reward function, where you can imagine the fires have negative reward, and then this malformed reward function, where they don't believe there's any fire because they don't know where it is, we have to figure out which fires do we need to communicate in order to get them to do the right thing. The way that we do that is by using forward rollouts of their assumed policy, right? And then every time we hit one of these negative states that we want them to avoid, we add it to a set. So we first roll it out, and they hit that bottom fire. We add that state, like a big negative reward to that state, and we reset. We run it again. Now they hit the top fire. We add a big negative reward there. We run it again. They hit the right exit. And so this gives us this set of like prohibited states that we want them to avoid. And so we use rollouts to figure that out. We also assume that we have a set of predicates. So the language that we're using, and due to time, I won't get into too much of the detail here. But the goal is using the predicates and the states we want them to avoid along with the policy that we think they already have, we have to figure out not only this trajectory that we want them to take, but also what we have to tell them to get them to take that trajectory. So we formulate this as an integer program. And I won't go through this in great detail, other than suffice to say, we want to minimize our cost. We want to make sure that we're telling them things like to avoid states that are different from the states we want them to take. We can figure out, which states have to be included, right? So like, what are the states that we definitely don't want them to be on? And we want to make sure that all of these states get included right in the utterance, the final utterance that we make. And so if we run this program, we get three possible cases out. And this is what happens when we don't necessarily have complete vocabulary. So things that could happen is we don't have specific enough language to only cover the precise states that we want them to avoid. And so when we solve this, we end up with three possible outcomes. One, we do have the language. We can solve this and we can tell them, hey, avoid these states. And that elicits the policy we want, and they cover the states we want them to cover by walking out the right exit. There's no solution that we can find, which says that we just don't have any language that's going to allow us to solve this problem for them. And then a more interesting case, which is that we have a solution, but some of the states we're telling them to avoid also, the predicates we're using are also going to cover, say, the trajectory we want them to take. So if that central hallway extended to the top and the bottom, right, of the hallway, then that's going to include states that we want them to be able to cover on their way out the door. So again, you see the three fires there. If central hallway also included the ones with the blue dotted line, that would be bad. And so case 3, we can detect that from the solution of our integer program. And we introduce in the paper a couple of ways that we can then come up with second or third or fourth best solutions that kind of avoid the imprecision of our language. And so I'd like to close on this thread by just showing a quick demonstration video of how this might work, even with two robots that are communicating through this semantic layer to update each other's policy on a table clearing task. So in this case, we have Sawyer clearing the table, and we have Movo that is supervising. And Movo has the real reward function, which says, don't throw away the grad students' Red Bull. But Sawyer doesn't have that. Sawyer just thinks that any table cleared object is good for it to do for the task. And we can see in the insets on the right that Movo knows that Red Bulls are bad because there's a red outline on them, but Sawyer on the bottom right has green around them because it doesn't know that yet. And so Movo is able to observe Sawyer as it goes through this process. And then once it becomes clear to Movo, though, that Sawyer is about to take an action that results in that negative reward, right? So this is a confusing behavior to Movo. It interrupts task progress and then can say, like, there's a bad reward if you do this, right? Or if Red Bull cans end up in the trash. Sawyer can update its policy and then complete the clearing task. And so this is just an example of this deployed on two robots, but we are running experiments on this with humans as well. And so with that, I will be happy to take any questions about any of the three papers or things related to them. So to recap, we covered learning from demonstration augmented by language narration to make a constrained motion planning problem. We talked about robots coaching people in the moment for updating their actions. And then we closed by extending this into policy elicitation. So getting robots to tell people things that not just change what they do in the moment, but also more broadly, the thing that generates their plans and their policies. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Brad. It was fantastic talk. And I know that we have already a few questions for you. One that we had was about the augmented learning from demonstration with the constraints. And so has your group thought about how to specify objectives that are not easy to specify using either tactile, programming by demonstration, or semantic input? For example, many multi-term objective functions fit this definition, such as the end effector should follow a straight line in the workspace as best as possible, but shouldn't break from that line if it's about to get in collision with an object. So kind of more complex situation.
So I think that's a really cool area, right, of these like constraint contingencies and prioritization. Because right now, no, there's definitely no sense of you're allowed to violate this constraint under these conditions, right? Which of course you would want the robot to spill, the cup out if the alternative was to hurt somebody. Right now, we haven't looked into that very much at all. We've primarily focused on trying to make the resulting sequential constrained motion planning problem more visible to the person and tractably solvable. And so I think one of the things that we end up with that like makes this really tricky is that without those examples, right? It's like without the like proofs of existence sort of good plans, we leave this to the constrained motion planner and we're going to be surprised with what we end up with. And especially with like maybe time blocked constraints like that, where it kind of depends on your previous state. If you're asking the gripper to move in like along a certain vector, I'm not sure what the right answer is off the top of my head for how to even get people to specify that, right, in a way that gets them the desired outcome.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking something like priorities, maybe. But
yeah, I think that would be a really, really cool study to run and interface to design where we do look at that kind of thing, like because of course people have that, right? Like we know when a constraint is like unable to be violated at any cost versus like, yeah, like we'll just clean it up and we'll start over again.
Mm-hmm. Nice. A couple of other questions. One from the chat. Does the intelligent agent need to evaluate how smart the human collaborator is to adjust its behavior or level of help? I think it was for the gamer.
So I'm asking, like, are we saying like evaluate the like how smart people are, right? Like, are we? Is one way? Is it like maybe an observation of that level of intelligence? Like their ability to like search forward in their or in a sense like propagate reward back using their policy convergence function.
Might be also like different levels of hints, from like really basic one, kind of like read mind what's the rules, or like kind of like more advanced.
Isolation, right? So don't do this, there's a better reward like all the way out here, or like don't do this, there's a bad reward all the way out here, but you can't connect the dots to that. Then I think in the worst case, it's the same as the control condition was, which is just saying, don't do that, right? Like, don't do that or something bad will happen. And so then you're just forced to try something else. Now, another thing I guess that's relevant here is that we weren't like time gating people, and we weren't saying you only get a limited number of interventions, right? The robot is infinitely patient, even if the people aren't. And so that would be something that would be worth looking at. I wonder if you could then basically see how well they responded or updated in response to the robot's advice, in order to figure out like really how far away are they? Is it just that they just forgot that one little thing, or like they just have no idea what they're doing? And I see Mike asked a question in chat about the explanations. Like, is this generally true that people are more likely to listen if there's an explanation? I don't really know, because I think that's going to heavily depend on the priors they bring in, both to the relationship with the speaker and the task. And in this case, we were only saying like something definitive about like this type of human-robot interaction where it's like fairly narrow band. That's the only thing that we can say something about definitively. But we're running more experiments with different types of tasks, including like more real-time and like non-say cognitive game, but like more like traditional manufacturing tasks, search and rescue tasks. So we'll hopefully have some better answers for that in the next year or two.
I mean, like I remember some research about someone cutting line and just saying, I need to go would be enough for acceptance. Or like someone going for copying some documents and saying, I need to copy documents would increase the acceptance rather than just going there. So sometimes just like obvious justifications are already enough to help.
Yeah, and I think that like this is ultimately an optimization problem, right? So one of the outcomes of an optimization problem could be like a selfish robot that gives you the excuse that it thinks you need to hear in order to allow it to do its thing.
Yep.
And we do have like a whole bunch of open questions really about like the ethical boundaries of these kinds of frameworks. So looking at just the emergency evacuation example from the building, right? We're trying to optimize for the human's expected reward. And the way it's doing that is it's figuring out like what to tell the person in order to get a policy that results in that. If we negate that optimization function, then you like end up with this psychopath robot, right? That's lying to you, telling you anything it thinks that you need to hear to put you in the worst possible situation, right? And like that's something that is a consequence of developing the positive case. And so this gets worse when the robot doesn't know what it knows and doesn't know, right? If it doesn't have a good model of its limitations, because it'll just confidently tell you, like, do this thing, because that's what my world model says is the right thing. But if we don't know that the robot's world model is correct, then we have quite a big problem.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I think we're slightly out of time, so we'll wrap up now. Thank you, Brad, one more time. It was really great to have your talk and was this kind of a quick discussion with you. And so we'll cut the stream in a second.
Great, thanks.